Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, today I've invited Mark Sheldon from Sidetrade back onto the podcast. He's been on the show before. I think it's been nearly 2 years, but he's almost a friend of the show now. So I wanted to bring him on here, especially after reading more about the launch of Sidetrade's AI-powered data lake. And the launch of that data lake is an industry first, especially for finance leaders, because it's one of the most unique data lake B2B payment behaviours on the market, and actually combines true AI with real-time collaborative intelligence. But what does that look like in the world of business? And how will it enable them to use predictive analytics and in a way to benchmark and make more strategic business decisions versus leveraging traditional, tactical, reactive data and all that? These are just a few areas that I want to discuss today, as well as how technology is enabling finance teams to transform into futurist teams. Incredibly exciting stuff, so buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to the UK, where Mark is waiting to talk about all this, along with the biggest myths around building and maintaining a huge data lake and the power of AI over RPA in a finance function. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. I think we last spoke in October 2020 when the world was a very different place. But I think then we were talking about how leadership and tech can impact business growth. But can you just remind the new listeners to the podcast a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's good to be back. Yes, I'm Mark. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Sidetrade. Just to give you a little bit of background, so I joined Sidetrade back in 2016. I oversee the global R&D team, so everything from product development, IT operations and support. Prior to Sidetrade, I was the co-founder of a predictive analytics startup that Sidetrade acquired, and essentially I've been part of the organisation ever since. So just very quickly, maybe just to tell you a little bit about Sidetrade. So we're a global fintech SaaS company specialising in the order-to-cash area. Essentially, we provide software into large B2B organisations to help their finance teams to really accelerate their cash collection. So we've invested really heavily in machine learning, data science over the past few years, and we're really proud to say we're a leader in the field. So we've most recently been recognised as one of the 3 leaders in the first Gartner Magic Quadrant for integrated invoice-to-cash applications. So it's a really proud step forward for us, I think.
Fantastic. And who are the other 2, just out of interest?
Oh, who are the other 2? Well, it's probably best actually to look at the report. It's not for me to disclose all the competitors, but the report is available on our website if anyone wants to take a look.
Very diplomatically answered. And of course, since we last spoke, as I said a few moments ago, the world has changed so much. And one of the reasons I was excited to get you back on was, yes, for a catch-up, and also the fact that you recently published a global payment trends from, I think it was Sidetrade's AI-powered data lake. So can you tell me a bit more about that and how that's helping your customers now?
Yeah, sure. So we, as I mentioned, we've invested a lot in AI over the past few years, and we call our AI engine actually Amy from a go-to-market point of view. Yeah. And what Amy actually does is analyzes all of our data behind the scenes, all of the payment and transaction history we have in our data lake to be able to make next best action predictions and actually push actions into our product that are the optimum action for a particular outcome. And what Amy is based on, Amy is effectively, or the data lake, if you like, is the engine behind Amy. So we have more than $4.5 trillion of B2B payment experiences from over 21 million companies worldwide. So we have a huge amount of data that sits in this data lake. And last month, as you say, we've recently revealed for the first time these kind of global payment trends from the data lake, which is pretty cool. So it's an industry first. We're able to show the breakdown of things like average payment delays across different countries, across different industries in like an interactive map. And we're going to regularly update it. And the whole point is really to support CFOs and finance teams during this period of uncertainty, we're expecting late payments to rise with rising inflation, supply chain issues and costs and so on. So really to make this information available, hopefully should be really interesting to many different people.
Were there any big themes in that report that really stood out for you?
Yeah, there's some interesting, it's interesting to see the best and worst countries and industries for late payment. So if you take like the US, for example, I think they appear 10th in the world in terms of their payment delay. And the UK and Ireland are among the top 5 worst in Europe for payment delays. So it's very interesting to see how different cultures and countries and across different industries are very different in terms of their performance.
So that's why my invoice has never paid on time. I know there'll be some science behind it somewhere. But of course, we're talking about very complex issues and matters here, and you make it sound incredibly simple. And I know it is not that simple. So can you dive a little bit deeper on how Sidetrade has built this data lake, and also the team and talent required and the kind of challenges you've had to overcome and the learnings along the way too?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's definitely been a long journey. It's not something that's happened overnight. And it actually started long before I joined Sidetrade. So I definitely can't take all the credit. But just actually the fact that we're a pure play SaaS company, all of our clients push their data to us. We're not an on-premise installation. So this gives us a big advantage in terms of our data. So from day one, we've been collecting data in our cloud in one place. So even before the cloud was a big deal. So we started consolidating, aggregating and anonymizing the data. Obviously, it's key for our customers that we look after their data and we anonymize it when we bring it all together. So we spent a lot of time doing this. And so originally it was just getting the data into one place. But then we really quickly realized to make this data useful, we needed some kind of reference of known companies that we could match against. So when we have an invoice from a particular from one supplier, we can then match the same buyer from an invoice from another vendor. So it's this matching process of buyers and suppliers. This became the initial big challenge for us. So back in 2016, we made 3 different acquisitions in the kind of data and AI space to reinforce our skills, tech and data assets. And from this, we started to build out what I describe as like a firmographic data store of companies. So this has got over 50 million companies in this data store. And we start to enrich that with machine learning, using natural language processing, web scraping, and all this kind of stuff. So we really start to build on this company firmographic lookup data set, if you like, that became the core of our data lake and data processing. So once we had this, we were able to then start to match new data, new companies against this referential. And we use this as for our master data management to be able to figure out who is who in our data lake and to build what we call this buyer referential, which is this network map of buyers and sellers in our network.
And as someone that's been on this journey for a few years and lived and breathed every aspect of it, I've got to ask, what are the biggest myths around building and maintaining a huge data lake, just for anybody listening out there? Because there is a lot of myths and misconceptions, isn't there, about what it takes? But I'm curious what you've learned from that.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is you don't need a huge team. I think for me, it's always been sort of quality over quantity, and the way you structure the team. And I think we talked about this last time around trying to drive innovation, getting teams structured into small kind of squads that work more like startups, but all aligned with a kind of strategic goal. And I think there's lots of evidence out with your startup companies like Tesla and WhatsApp. These guys using very small teams to do something that competitors can't, even with thousands of engineers. So I think there's something around, as we discussed last time, innovation and how you structure your team to drive this kind of thing is absolutely key. So that's probably the first thing. I think focusing on business objectives rather than shiny new technology. And it's crazy that a CTO would say this, but it's very typical, I think, for tech companies and tech people to very much always focus on, let's use the greatest new technology out there. But I think for me, it's all about actually focusing on the business outcome. Yeah. So how do we get something to a customer as quick as humanly possible? I've seen too many R&D teams spending years building something really, really advanced that never actually delivers any value to the. So I think that would be another thing I would say. I think another thing we talked about with the culture of innovation last time, I think not obsessing over perfection. It's kind of linked really with my previous point, but being really clear on this business objective. What's the priority? How can we get value quicker? Focus on doing some simple stuff, getting it in front of the customer, and then iterating on top of this. I think this is really, really important stuff in terms of actually delivering something of value in the data and AI space. There's probably two other key points I would say that are more things to watch out for, really, I think. I mean, obviously, what you need to build a data lake and AI, you need a lot of data. It's fairly obvious, really. It's not so easy to do when you have no data to learn from. But even when you do have a lot of data, it's still not straightforward. I think you really need, when you're deploying AI and using data in an organization, you need a business that's mature enough to act upon this insight. So, that even when you create some really interesting predictive insights, the business needs to be able to take action on it. So, for example, you might need to push this insight into the frontline systems for a sales team to be able to execute on, or push data into a support system for a support team to act upon, and it needs to be actionable. And then you need to be able to measure the ROI or the return. How much better is that than what the end user was doing before when they used the new insight? So what value does it actually add to the business? And I think that leads on to the last point. Without the culture and trust of AI, it's always doomed to failure. So when a support agent, with my last example, gets a notification from an AI engine notifying them of a certain scenario with a customer, they need to really be able to trust this data. They need to know that, they need to understand why. They need this trust effectively to be able to take the advice of a machine versus following, a previous process or their human intuition. And often it's a combination of both that you need. So, but you definitely need this trust and a culture that AI is really powerful. He's trained on lots of historic data, so he's often providing stuff that humans can't. But I think this combination of using humans with AI is still super, super powerful. And that's what we see with Amy in the real world within our products.
And I'm glad you've mentioned that and brought up the word trust as well, because so much has changed in the last 2 years. And one of the big things that I've noticed is attitudes towards AI and things like RPA, etc., because it was treated with suspicion to begin with. A lot of people think it's just going to replace people, also thinking it's overhyped. But over these last 2 years, we've seen how people are seeing the value that it can offer businesses. And it's not about competing for job roles, but actually complementing employees in their roles and helping them to deliver more value to the entire business. But on that side of things, can you tell me a little bit more about the power of AI over RPA, especially around the finance function?
Yeah, I think lots of people I think AI and RPA are often very much confused in the real world. The reality is, as you say, lots of people have started, especially in the finance space, they've started on this journey using RPA or effectively automating human processes. So if they have a repetitive human task, they're able to use technology, which is really cool technology, by the way. I don't think it's not that this is a bad thing from an RPA point of view, but it is really just automating repetitive human tasks. So this works really well in a lot of use cases, but often these processes can be quite hard to maintain. And the biggest danger is with RPA, you're often replicating a bad process that a human has already done, albeit they just do it a lot quicker from a robotic point of view. So I think the big difference with AI is where you're actually making an intelligent decision based on using a machine learning algorithm that's been trained on huge amounts of historic data, actually way more than a human could ever learn from, and then able to apply that to a scenario in real time. So you have an outstanding, in our case, we have an outstanding invoice for a certain amount with a certain buyer for a certain set of products that's due on a certain day. We know all this information about this invoice, and we're able then to make a real-time prediction at that point in time as to what the optimum thing to do with that invoice is. What's the optimum next best action to collect this outstanding invoice? And that's something, if you were automating a repetitive task, you would do the same thing all the time, or maybe have a set of rules that you would apply from an RPA point of view. So it's very, very different. It is truly intelligent versus, I don't want to say dumb automation, but effectively just repetition. I mean, the good thing is you don't need so much data. You can start to automate your existing tasks, but it's really not a truly intelligent process at all.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was trying to do a little bit of research and find out what you've been up to for today's conversation. One of the things that stood out was your belief that technology actually enables finance teams to transform into futurist teams. Can you expand on that belief?
Yeah, I think from a CFO point of view, it's really a changing world. I think everything, and it's changing rapidly. We're seeing a big shift towards digitalization. So especially in today's kind of climate where cash is really king, I think finance are really looking at how they can optimize their team, how they can collect cash faster. And I think it's becoming more of a front row seat, if you like, in terms of the priorities of every single business. So I think with all of these challenges around, finance organizations are really looking at how they optimize all of their processes, as I say. So investing in digitization, I think, is top of the agenda for many, many CFOs. And to be honest, I think over the past few years, the CFOs that have stood out from the crowd are the ones that have really driven digitization projects and shown how successful they can be. But to be honest now, this is becoming the expectation now as a CFO, that you look across all of the order to cash cycle. How can you use technology to optimize my team, to optimize the processes, to optimize the customer experience as well, which is key. So optimize every step in that chain and to drive more value to the business.
Fantastic. And as I said earlier, you're right in the heart of this space. You actually live and breathe it. You're surrounded by everything that's going on. So what excites you about the future and where everything is heading? Are there any particular trends that you're following closely?
Yeah, I think there's probably two elements for me personally. I mean, from the business point of view, in the finance order to cash space, I'm quite excited about the connected network, if you like. So we've talked about our data lake and the map of buyers and sellers that we now have, but the ability to connect those together intelligently and then to automate the end-to-end processing between buyers and sellers. This is a really exciting topic around the connected network, if you like, and this is an area that we're pushing towards. And so this definitely excites me from a business and a product point of view. I think from a technical point of view, really, well, as we have so many machine learning models, we've invested so much in AI recently or over the past few years, like many companies. Lots of our focus now is on what I would call AI ops or machine learning ops. So how do we maintain these models? How do we automate the retrain? So from a technical point of view, this is quite a key topic for us. I think on a bigger picture, I would say from a technology landscape, I'm really excited about quantum computing. I think I mentioned this on our last podcast. I think this is going to have such a huge potential impact on machine learning, AI. It could really change the world, in my opinion. So this is what I'm excited about, and a trend definitely to follow.
So with all your insights and the trends that you're following and seeing how the industry is taking shape, what's going to be your big focus for the next year and beyond? I appreciate there's probably not too much you can share, but is there anything you can?
Yeah, I think we can't give away too many things, but I think it's fair to say we're focusing more on the kind of more real-time use cases, so streaming data, making data more up to, so really trying to focus on these real-time streaming use cases, how we improving some of our tooling, making data more accessible within the organization as well as externally. So we've talked about the data lake tooling that we've released publicly. So this kind of thing, making data more available internally to developers, to our data scientists, and also to the wider organization to be more data-driven throughout marketing and even publicly, making some of our data available for the greater good to the outside world. So these are the key things that we're working on now and looking to in the future.
Excellent. Well, it's been It's been amazing to have you back on the podcast today. But the only thing that's changed since we last spoke is I always try and have a bit of fun with my guests at the end of every episode. And after recording 2,000 interviews, I'm starting to realise the role of serendipity and the universe and what it has on our success after listening to so many different stories and origin stories of people's success. And I also know some of the biggest names in business, VC funding and tech have either been guests on here or listened to this podcast. So with all that in mind, I want to throw something out in the universe today and say, is there a person that you'd love to have a private breakfast or lunch with, and why? And hopefully he or she might just listen to this.
Wow, it's a tough question. There's probably lots of them. I would say probably Mo Gaudat would be one. So he's a former CBO at Google X. Really, really interesting guy. Wrote Solve for Happy and more recently Scary Smart. So really interesting book around how AI is the biggest risk to the human race and how we can save ourselves effectively. So this guy's really, really interesting and quite related to some of the topics we've been talking about today.
Fantastic. Well, that's out there now. Hopefully something will happen. All I'll say is if anything does, just let me know. I want a picture of the two of you drinking a cappuccino or something. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just want to find out more information about Sidetrade, Amy, data lakes, anything we've discussed today, or even contact your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
Yeah, I think probably to the website, sidetrade.com is the best place to go.
Excellent. Well, I'll have that link to the show notes so people can find you nice and easy. I think we've covered so much in a short amount of time today. All I think I will say as we end the podcast is let's not leave it another 2 years before we have a catch up, but just a big thank you for telling me about everything you've been doing now and the amazing thing you're doing with AI and real-time collaborative intelligence. Thanks again, Mark.
Yeah, no problem, Neil. Thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have Mark back on the podcast. And especially today for sharing how Sidetrade has built this data lake. Also shared some of the incredibly valuable insights around that, especially around the team and the talent that's required, the challenges and learnings, and busting a few myths along the way. And with all that in mind, it's no surprise that Sidetrade was recently named one of the leaders in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Integrated Invoice-to-Cash applications. Who are the other two? Well, we're not going to talk about them today. You'll have to find them out for yourself, as Mark diplomatically answered. But a big thank you for listening. If you'd like to carry on this conversation around invoice-to-cash applications or anything we've talked about, especially around data lakes, etc., email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. We'll keep this conversation going. But that's it for today. We've talked about everything from AI over RPA and data lakes, integrated invoice-to-cash applications. But what does that leave us to talk about tomorrow? Well, I'm going to spin the wheel, which will determine what topic we will discuss. It'll be something completely different, I can promise you that much. To find out the actual answer, for that, I'm going to keep you coming back for more. I'm going to invite you to join me again one more time, and we'll discuss something differently. So a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.